Professor Bandelow, welcome. It's nice to have you here today. Professor Bandelow is a medical expert. He studied medicine in Göttingen and Tübingen. On top of that, he also studied psychology. He then became a neurologist, a psychiatrist, and a psychotherapist. In 1997, he received his doctorate. He has got an extraordinary professorship at the University of Göttingen, where he's also working as a senior scientist. And very importantly, he is the founder and the honorary president of the Association for Anxiety Research. Now, if you want to read one of his nice books, and he's written many, one rather better known is called Das Angstbuch, the anxiety book, where fears and anxieties come from and how to combat them. Let me just tell you on the side that for those who are at risk of falling asleep, don't do it. Take a huge gulp of coffee, whatever gets you through the day, eat a piece of chocolate, perhaps a handful of popcorn, because Professor Bandelow is also a member of the Göttingen-based doctors band, the Hot Dogs, and they are using their income for charitable ends, and you can read up on that in the internet. He was at the grammar school in Westerstede when he was a student, and he is said to have been the inventor of jokes about people living in the area called Ostfriesland. So we're now looking forward to your presentation. Thank you very much for your kind introductory words. Unfortunately, this does not seem to be working. Right, okay. Okay, this is slightly slow. I have to go back. Okay. Now, between fear and confidence or optimism, that is today's subject, and I am an expert on anxiety and fear. But first we have to differentiate, because there are different sorts of fears. The one is real fear, and the other one is a kind of, unreal fear that people suffering from anxiety disorders are victims of. Real fears would be, for example, the fear of accidents, disease, or losing loved ones, war, terrorism, or losing money, or corona, of course. On the other hand, there are the anxiety disorders. Very frequently, or rather very frequent anxiety disorders are, they are the ones that are most likely to affect people in the field of psychiatry. And people are afraid of many very banal things. People who might be afraid of pedestrian zones even before corona, or lifts, or mice. So things that normally would not have to scare you necessarily. So here you can see someone who jumped out of a height of 50 kilometers just with a parachute on his back. This was Felix Baumgartner. He was afraid of the space suit. So he did not really have a real fear, but he had the unreal fear, or irrational fear of getting into this space suit, and he never enjoyed doing that, and that was what almost killed the whole endeavor. So, in our brain we've got a different weighting of different fears. People with anxiety disorders might actually be people who are not fearful at all. Now, when talking about the different anxiety disorders, what are the most frequent phobias in Germany? And as we don't have people sitting in this room, I will have to answer these questions myself, unfortunately. There are a couple of phobias, or a few phobias, like the allium phobia, which is where people are afraid of garlic. Probably not the most frequent one in Germany. The aulophobia would be being afraid of flutes, or venostrophobia is when people are afraid of beautiful women. Or the xenophobia, people would be afraid of moles. And pelatophobia is when people are afraid of bald people. Paraskevatria would mean that you're afraid of Friday the 13th. And this is the anatideophobia. Would mean that you're afraid of being stared at by ducks, especially when they are looking through your window next to your airplane seat. And the next fear is also a very hard one. That is the arachibutyrophobia, that is being afraid of peanut butter that sticks to your palate. And the next phobia, here I have to take a deep breath, that is the hippopotamonster-equidaliophobia, that is the fear of long words. That's what I'm afraid of. But these are not very frequent phobias. Now, what is one of the rather more common phobias? Now, we've got the specific phobias, who are the record holders. Those are the things where you are afraid of one singular thing. And for example, spiders here. That is one of the most frequent phobias to be encountered in Germany, is the fear of spiders. This is one of the larger spiders that actually bite when you blow on them. And then people with the specific phobias hardly ever visit doctors, psychologists, or psychiatrists in order to receive treatment because people think that they can deal with it. But then there are people who suffer from panic attacks or panic disorders. Those are the ones who rather more frequently, or most frequently, actually go to the psychiatrist in order to receive treatment because they are rather limited in their everyday lives because of these panic attacks. You know, they've got a racing heart, they sweat profusely, they have difficulties taking a deep breath. Those are the situations where people are just sitting on the sofa suffering a panic attack, or when people are in crowds, for example. So here, this is the underground in Tokyo, for example, and in the past, they were so crowded that they had special employees who would push the last remaining passengers and squeeze them into the wagons. So this is a situation where people can suffer from agoraphobia. So this is actually part of a really fixed couple here. People who also have agoraphobia are also afraid of suffering panic attacks. Then there is the generalized anxiety disorder. This is for people who are actually afraid of real dangers, like, they might be more afraid of corona than other people. And then there are social phobias. Here you can see a gentleman who apparently does not suffer from a social phobia, but if you do, then it means that you're afraid of situations where you might embarrass yourself, where you might be criticized, where you might end up in the center of attention, and of course it's also about how to deal with members of the opposite sex, and that you feel like you might be putting your foot in and that it might end up being embarrassing for you. That is a very frequent phobia, even more frequent than the panic disorders, and yet many of the people affected do not consult their doctor because they just think they're shy and do not need to have it treated. But in reality it can be a very severe form of disorder. Now let's move on to the point, or rather the question of what is happening in our brain whenever we feel afraid. Here you can see a green viper, for example, in the jungle in Thailand. And this image of this green viper is being then recognized by your eyes, and then it's being transported on into an area that's called the thalamus. And the thalamus is then tasked with deciding whether you need to have a fast or a slow reaction. The faster reaction comes first because a snake might strike with a speed of 50 meters per second. That is faster than Mike Tyson's punch. So you would have to actually take a huge step backwards, otherwise this green viper might get you. And this is what the thalamus would do. It would first trigger a quick physical reaction, but it also activates, part of our pituitary gland, for example, the amygdala. And here, for example, you've got the reflex that would make you play dead, for example, but it is also where you feel mortal fear. And then there is, of course, also the possibility of trying to appease your opponent, like dogs would do when they're wagging their tails. We as humans can't. And this is the locus ceruleus. This is where your blood pressure and your pulse is being increased. And then we've got the nervus parabrachialis, which increases your breathing frequency. And then there are other areas like the hypothalamus, and this is where the sympathetic nerve system is being activated. It should actually be called the unsympathetic nerve system because, the feeling of flight or fright, like a quickly beating heart and, a tremor or a sweating are being actually perceived as being very, very unpleasant. And then there is the so-called stress axis, which is then activated by the hypophysis. And then there is also the longer pathway. The thalamus would have to first analyze what it just saw, and then it would ask the hippocampus. The hippocampus would then do a search on the larger hard drive. The hard drive would say, "Nah, this was not a green viper, it was just a small green lizard." But the panic reaction was already kick-started because you were not fast enough to analyze it. It looked like a snake, it moved like a snake, it was green, so first reaction would be to trigger a panic before you have a sound and profound analysis of the situation. And it actually happens within microseconds. And then, we go the way backward. Then the hippocampus would tell the amygdala, okay, calm down, everything's good, it was just a lizard. And that is what would happen here. Now we would have to make a distinction again. You know, we've got this fear system in our brain, and this fear system is basically comparable to the development of a chicken. And then we've got a different area, which is called the prefrontal cortex. But the fear area that you can see encircled here is, in terms of our evolution, very, very old. We already heard in one of the presentations, you know, even in the previous presentation, a colleague talked about our Stone Age brain. And animals have this kind of fear processing brain as well that would warn them. And this is a system that is vital for survival, because in emergency situations, this would be the more important system, not our thinking brain, but the rather more primitive fear processing brain. And here, it does not really compute or process old knowledge or learned knowledge. I mean, it may contain some experiences that once you touched a hot barbecue, you wouldn't do that again, but there are also certain innate phobias, like, for example, the spider phobias. That is not a learned behavior. It is actually something that is innate or congenital, if you will. You know, Mr. Seligman was mentioned in a previous presentation. He actually said, already pointed out that there are things that are not only learned, but there are also things that are actually already, you know, prepared in our brains. And the reality is something like spider phobia does not need to be learned, but it really is something that you're being born with.
So there is no processing of knowledge and no planful thinking. And then we've got the prefrontal cortex. This is the area of our rationality, of where we think as human beings. And this is where we realize that we are afraid. And in terms of our evolutionary history, this is something new and doesn't exist in animals to that extent, at least it doesn't. So, for instance, when it comes to order of magnitude, in a rat, the fear brain is way bigger than the prefrontal cortex. And don't get me wrong, this is not a survival system, but it serves to process knowledge. It can think in a planful way and can provide us with a piece of awareness that we are afraid, but it recedes whenever the fear brain jumps in, whenever we are faced with a crisis. Now, as I've been talking about anxiety disorder and about treating it, I could go on for hours about it, but I'm going to be very brief. My mother used to give me a glass of beer, or she gave me a present which read happiness, or just doctors discharge and God heals, and this is, and how do people actually think about how they can help you? This is the way they think they can help you. And actually, there are guidelines for it, and in accordance with clinical guidelines of clinical trials, there is some insight we can quote. For instance, these two guidelines of the World Federation of Societies for Biological Psychiatry, or the German S3 guideline for anxiety disorders. So what they stipulate is something that we can summarize very easily. There are two things that help us to treat anxiety disorders. You can forget about the rest. It is behavioral therapy and antidepressants. One thing does not act better than the other. And in one study, we found that antidepressants have a stronger effect than behavioral therapy, mind you, but we have to leave it to the patient of what to choose. And the recommendation is to combine both if you want to actually get rid of your anxiety. And the good thing about it is that you don't need to end up in psychiatry. You can follow an outpatient treatment, a combination of both treatments. So this was, in a nutshell, what I had to say about anxiety disorders. Now, fear is not a good advisor, was said before. I would not subscribe to that 100%. It also suggests some ideas to us that sometimes can be quite helpful, sometimes they aren't, but you have to differentiate here. I'm always saying that fear is not a good statistician, and we've learned that the fear brain is very primitive, it's not very proficient at statistics. So whenever a new fear, new anxiety arises in the wake of the swine flu, the bird flu, a terror attack, our brain just panics and our fear brain jumps in and no longer the rational brain. So in the beginning of a crisis, we are more afraid of those new dangers than we are of known dangers. So when we must not forget that within 1 year, 9,000 people die from accidents or are affected by accidents in the domestic realm and 9,000 in other leisure activities. So many people have died of the coronavirus, unfortunately, but if you look at the order of magnitude of how many people die in skiing accidents or horse riding accidents, or more people die in actually household chores that they do. They fall off a ladder or something just falls on their heads, and 43% of people die from cardiovascular diseases. And even in Germany, there was one natural disaster with 20,000 fatalities. I don't have an audience around me that I could ask about it, unfortunately, but nobody comes up with an idea about what this might have been. These are heat waves, actually. So heat waves actually caused 20,000 people to die in 1 year. And some dangers are even overestimated because they actually link up with our primal fears. For instance, the fear of wild animals, savage animals, or the fear of spiders and snakes. And this is also very important because otherwise there'd be so many people actually succumbing in our history. But let's quote plane crashes. This also provides us with an association of a primal fear, or the fear of falling from great heights. This just suggesting to us this is not your place to be. You're not a bird. You're not good at free falling. You have a problem here. And this is why we're afraid much more about planes than we are of driving to the airport, which might turn out to be much more dangerous than being on that flight, actually. And we're also overly afraid of wolves. We must say, for instance, in the 8 years here between 2010 and 2018, we had 24 casualties from wolf attacks, so most of them in India and Pakistan, by the way, but just on one motorway in North Germany, on the A2 in 2018, there were 24 road casualties, road accident fatalities. So this is just a proportion of things. Still, we are more afraid of the wolf than we are of just being on the motorway. And what is even more frequent than plane crashes are falling coconuts in Thailand. So several hundreds of deaths a year. Often it's tourists, by the way. People just lying on the beach. What is also more often happening than plane crashes are being hit by and kicked by a donkey in Greece, or swallowing ball pens, 300 deaths per year, or out of 313 women hit by their partners, 154 women die. You don't actually think of that very often, do you? And also, when you ask people whether murders have been on the rise, many people would respond, yes, definitely so, but you can read news statistics that start in the 2000s and go down to 2015. And this period of time, we've seen a decline of murder cases by 40%, and still the population considers this to be quite different. And let me just point out that fact that we have that trend, this tendency, this inclination towards the negative. Let me come up with a different example. Donald Trump tried to actually rule out the possibility for certain nationals to travel into the country for fear of suffering from terrorist attacks. So the number of Americans that were killed in 2016 were either caused by immigrant Islamists, that were just 2, native Islamists 9, armed toddlers 21, lawnmowers 69, falling from bed 737, and being shot by another American 11,737. So this puts things into perspective. Sometimes our way of perceiving things differs quite largely, and what we tend to underestimate is dangers that are not actually linking up to senses. I just told you about the fear brain before, which stays at a very low level of intelligence, like the one of a chicken, and it just boils down to the senses, smelling fire, feeling pain, just hearing a loud noise, looking at a wild animal. So those senses are, of course, always of the essence to be able to experience fear. But for instance, nuclear power, something we cannot see, we cannot hear, we cannot smell, unless there's something blowing off a great deal of noise, but otherwise we tend to believe that nuclear radiation is not such a dangerous thing. Another example is cybercrime, which is something invisible and you can't hear it, because criminals see to that. They cannot be caught, and this is why so many companies in Germany become and fall victim to cybercrime, because they simply close their eyes on it and don't want to see it. I told you about the dichotomy between the fear brain and the rational brain, but there's also a reward system, by the way, and the reward system is also crucial. It is in charge of anything that's nice and good. And those two systems, the reward system and the fear system, they are in a certain relationship towards one another, just like Christ and the Antichrist. So the reward system is us looking for contentment, satisfaction, like eating, drinking, and sex, and the fear system constantly tells us, well, there's something bad, you can have children, you're going to end up having children, it costs a lot of money, it's dangerous, it's impairing your health, and they're always in constant conflict, and the rationality, a rational system has to be the intermediary between the two. Why do I show you a photo of an elephant? The two systems are just like an elephant, which has a brain the size of an apple, but the boy riding the elephant can guide the elephant elegantly through the jungle. But mind you, if that elephant has a rage attack or a testosterone surge, then the boy is no longer able to control the elephant, because these two systems would then no longer be in balance and can no longer be controlled once the elephant's rationality actually stops. So there needs to be good balance between those two systems. And then we have something like feeling like experiencing fear, and this is where the reward system jumps in. So when being in a roller coaster, we just rush down, and when we're in the next curve, we will be flooded by fear hormones in our brain, but what also sets in is endorphins at the same time, because whenever we are afraid, we also liberate those endorphins that are supposed to protect us from suffering the blow or the hit, us hitting the floor. They are responsible for nice feelings when eating, drinking, and having sex, but they also create freedom from pain and create euphoria. And this leads to a situation where we feel quite at ease. Why are those endorphins emitted and also liberated? It's because we think, well, an accident is about to happen, an accident is imminent, and we thus produce those endorphins in order to be able to act when, for instance, fighting with an animal, a wild animal. So it helps us to survive and to pull through that fight for a longer period of time, because we don't suffer any pain and we are carried by euphoria. This is what endorphins are for. And in that roller coaster, once you've been through that curve, fear will subside and endorphins are still in our blood, and this is what we pay our €8 ticket for. Same goes for crime series. So once the killer is caught at last, then you no longer feel afraid, and the endorphins but still stuck in your blood, and you can go to sleep calmly and quietly, but beforehand you still need to trigger that anxiety by having that young lady die. And for the same reason, we take predilection in things that happen to other people. Ghastly disasters that happen to other people trigger a paradoxical feeling of satisfaction in ourselves because of that endorphin triggering effect. And when bungee jumping, we also feel afraid at first, and after overcoming that fear, we feel at ease. So it's nothing better in the world than being shot at and not being hit. So let me draw to a close in a bit. Let me raise the question whether there is German angst. Does that exist? There's something that we might call a north-south divide of fear. angst. So people living in northern countries are more fearful than people in southern countries. So Norwegians and the Finns are even more afraid than we are. So the more you go up north, the more fearful people are. And this is something that resonates quite well in the fact that people spend more money on insurances, they save money more massively, they've got fewer road accidents, and they have fewer coronavirus fatalities. But they've also got these strange security alerts, like, for instance, the fact that you cannot use your microwave oven for drying pets. How come that, of all things, people are so fearful in the north? This might be down to evolution. People who participated in the great period of migrations, they all originated from Africa and ended up in Europe at some point 40 million years ago. So big people's migration movements took place at that time, and people set off in Africa, migrating to other parts of the world. And when they came into Germany or to other parts of the world, they had to deal with a situation where for 6 months in the year they couldn't grow any plants, so they had to stockpile supplies. So they had to plan ahead for 6 months so that they could actually make it to the long winter. And those that felt concern and worry actually did that stockpiling, whereas the reckless starved. And this was the reason for people actually indulging in panic buying when faced with crises. Although, rationally speaking, chicken or hens will continue to lay eggs, so we do not actually stockpile eggs or flour, but this is just panic buying of your fear brain.
And let's now move on to our next point, and that is the question of whether corona leads to an increase of anxiety disorders, depressions, and suicides. Donald Trump in March 2020 said that because of the recession, thousands would die of suicides. And because in March he did not want, and it turned out to be a fatal mistake when looked at from today, he did not want to have a lockdown in the US. And I just recently saw a video from one of the German protesting people, Bodo Schiffmann, who was a doctor, laryngologist, and he said because of the lockdown we had an increase of suicides in Berlin by 600%. That was not true. The number of emergency calls because of suicides in Berlin from January until the end of April 2020 went down by 5.3% as compared to the previous year. And in North Rhine-Westphalia, the federal state, people actually saw that the number of intended and actually carried out suicides since the beginning of the lockdown went down by 20%. So there was not a general trend to be observed across the whole nation, but definitely not a negative trend either. And of course it can only first be determined if you've got the documents of the coroners, for example, and collect them and then study them as a whole, and that might be the time in 1 or 2 years then. There was an investigation of the Deutsche Ärzteblatt between January and July 2020. There was decrease of suicides by 30% in the city of Frankfurt in 2020. And, as a psychiatrist, I can also confirm that we do not have a run of patients for psychiatric hospitals because of suicidality or anxiety disorders. The opposite is true. It is actually going down by 20%. And it means that people always thought that people were afraid of getting infected, but over the summer there were actually psychotherapeutic clinics and hospitals that were closed because they hardly had any patients. But of course also in order to avoid a transmission of the disease. And then we set up video consultations, but they were not really accepted by the patients either, or demanded. So there was not the kind of increase in psychiatric disorder that was initially forecast. This is where people actually painted too dark a picture. And this leads us over to the conspiracy theories. There is a tendency of people in times of crisis to gather around a leader. And those people, in Germany we call them the COVID-idiots in general, but those leaders I would say they are corona-narcissists because they're quite frequently narcissistic persons. You may be familiar with a couple of names that you've heard on television, people who have others gather around them explaining to them that corona is non-existent. But how do we explain that we've got these COVIDiots that would follow the corona-narcissists? Well, the fear-based brain wins against the rational brain in times of crisis. And we also heard that fear is not a good statistician. 5% decrease is being reinterpreted into an increase of 600%. So that is not really a sound statistic, of course. And the tendency to fend off fear by trying to not even perceive the danger. And if there is someone who says corona is non-existent, then you've got a very simple worldview that is easy to deal with and that soothes your fear brain. Of course, not your rational brain, but it's at least something. Now, conspiracy theories, the Jews triggered the plague epidemic, that is a very old one, from the 14th century, really, or that the Germans intentionally triggered the Spanish flu. Then there is the Flat Earth Society that claims that Earth is a disk, as you can see here, or that there is no connection between the HIV virus and AIDS, or that the Vatican owns a time-traveling machine, that the moon landing was just a fake, or that Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was replaced by a doppelganger, or that in Roswell, in New Mexico, 1947, a UFO crashed. But Marilyn Monroe, Elvis, Michael Jackson, and King Ludovic, they were all murdered, and these are all just conspiracy theories. And now let me come to the end. There are three phases when it comes to fear in times of corona. In the first phase, we had a disproportionate feeling of fear. That is where our fear brain actually got the better of our rational brain. And this is where people did panic purchases and stockpiled, where this kind of Stone Age instinct of the hamster comes to the fore. And then, of course, there was also a rise in conspiracy theories. But then there was the second phase in the summer, a realistic phase. We actually saw that with the help of a lockdown, we were able to limit the number of new infections. People adhered to the rules, and now we are in a phase 3. I don't know whether there will be a phase 4 and 5, but currently people are trying to, somehow arrange their lives around the risks and dangers. Everyone comes up with their own risk profiles, and the warnings of politicians, doctors, and virologists are not really taken seriously any longer, although the risk is increasing. Everyone for themselves are assuming, well, I haven't had corona the past 3 months, so I'm not very likely to catch it for the next couple of weeks. If you were to translate to safety belts, if you said, well, I haven't used my safety belt in the last 3 months, so I won't need them from now on either. That would be an analogy. That is the phase 3 that we're currently in, and it's a very dangerous phase because everyone is trying to determine their own personal risk profile. Okay, let me skip that because we're running later, but these are a few take-home messages, if you will. And this is also what I'd like to use as the closing slides for my presentation. As I said, the fear brain is compatible to the brain of a chicken, and that fear is a bad statistician, we also heard about that, and that happiness cannot be measured in euros, and that fear is also the superfuel for success. Let me say a few words about that. People ask me how to deal with fear, and I said, well, with respect and a healthy dose of fatalism. Respect, I mean that we should not underestimate the real risks, and a healthy fatalism means that we should also tell ourselves, well, things have always worked out so far, and we will probably not die of it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank, Herr Professor Bandelow.
Thank you very much, Professor Bandelow. Indeed, do we have questions from the people here in the room or online? I already have a few questions here. Okay, the first question is the following. Creating fear, is that a business model? And for how long can this state of mind be conserved? I mean, in war, people actually start getting used to a hail of bombs from above. Well, that is a very good argument. There are these so-called influencers, and that those are the ones that are influencers on all kinds of social media channels, and they try to get as many people to their own websites or web presences by spreading drastic and absurd news. And the more drastic and absurd their news are, the more clicks they generate, and that translates into money, because they're selling advertising space there. So this is a business model. But then there are also others, who stoke fear, and it's always been one of the instruments that was used in politics. Stoking the fear of your enemy within or without, outside of your country, so as to make people forget about the problems that they're facing in their own country currently. Let me come to the second part of your question. Do we get accustomed to fear? Of course we know from people who live in Kabul, where you've got bombs going off every day, or people living in Rio de Janeiro, where people are being robbed on an almost daily basis, and there's still people are dancing samba in the streets of Rio, and sometimes appear to be happier with their lives than people in the stock exchange, or the area around the stock exchange in the city of Frankfurt. Of course you can get used to everything. Even if Corona turns out to be much worse than so far, we will not lose all of our quality of life and our happiness. Well, I think that is a very important statement to make. Thank you. Now, during your presentation, you also said, and you were talking about the evolution, that, people who were rather more concerned and fearful would stockpile food, and the reckless ones would starve. Now, what is the kind of recommendation to deduce from that? Should we stockpile food or not? Well, no, that was, a very wise piece of advice 20,000 years ago. Not necessarily today, because we were assured that there is no reasonable reason why we should stockpile food. Even during the first phase, we could see that it was absolutely useless, didn't make any sense whatsoever, and we shouldn't be doing it this time around either. Please don't stockpile food or toilet paper. Okay, let's move on to the next question from one of our online viewers. Could things like, corona fatalities or traffic fatalities, could they not just be the consequences of our economic stage of development? Well, I'd say that, of course, traffic casualties, that is definitely also caused by our economic development. In Germany, we used to have times when we had 18,000 casualties in traffic. That is 3 times as many, or 6 times as many as today. Now we've got airbags, we've got safety belts, so we've learned to protect ourselves. And Corona doesn't have anything much to do with our economy, I think, except, of course, for the fact that because people are traveling and are flying all over the world, the disease is being spread more quickly. It took 3 years for the Spanish flu to move from Marseille in France to get to Northern Europe. That took 3 years. And today it just takes a few months or even only weeks, and that has something to do with the way we travel, that we are using airplanes and other kinds of vehicles that allow us to speed through so many different countries in such a short time. But I don't think that we can roll that back. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Bandelow, for your presentation.